Good evening and welcome to this Veritas Forum in Leiden. We're so glad that you've tuned in tonight to, together with us, reflect on the big questions of life. This event is organized in collaboration with ForumC and is made possible financially by the European Solidarity Corps. Tonight's conversation will be about Twilight of the Gods, with a central question: why should we even care about a god? We're very delighted that we have Professor Alistair McGrath and Mr. Boris van der Ham with us tonight to discuss this important topic. I will shortly introduce them. Professor Alistair McGrath is a British theologian, priest, historian and scientist. He has written many books, of which the latest is currently being translated into Dutch. This book, Het Raadsel van God, will be published next month. Our second speaker is Mr. Boris van der Ham. He's an author, actor, columnist and is also actively involved in het Humanistisch Verbond and Humanists International. He has also written many books, and one of them you can win if you fill out our survey at the end of this forum. Tonight's conversation will be led by David Bogert, a journalist for the EO and a podcast maker. As a viewer, you can also participate tonight by asking questions and giving your opinion at our Slido, that is sli.do, with event code Veritas. You can find the description of this in the description of our YouTube live stream. Especially at the end, there will be room for questions from the audience. And that's all I wanted to say now. I wish you a very good and inspiring evening.
Thank you, Timon, for this introduction. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Boris van der Ham. Good evening, Alistair McGrath.
Good evening.
We have an important topic to talk about this evening. Why should or shouldn't we care about the belief in God? And we're going to give you both an opening statement of about 10 minutes without me annoyingly interrupting you. So we're going to first start with Mr. McGrath. Welcome, it's great to have you here. Unfortunately, you couldn't be here in person because of the whole COVID thing, even though you guys in the UK are way ahead of us with the vaccination. I heard even the pubs and the restaurants are open there. Did you go already to a pub?
Not yet, but they are open.
They are open. We're not at all jealous, right, Boris?
We are very jealous.
Very jealous. Sorry. That's more truthful, actually. You're, of course, known as a prominent defender of the Christian faith. But what many people might not know is that you were an atheist when you were starting in university, at Oxford University, studying chemistry, I think. How did that came to be? Were you brought up as an atheist, or did you become one?
Well, I grew up in the 1960s, and the 1960s were very radical, and I got caught up in a radical scientific Marxist atheism, which I thought was an intellectual nirvana, and really was very aggressively atheist as a young man. But then I went to Oxford to study science properly, and actually that made me rethink a lot of things.
All
So
right.
I guess it was a phase I went through, although I have to say it was a very important phase from which I learned a lot.
And you have a PhD in biophysics, and you have a PhD in theology. You're both a scientist and an ordained priest in the Anglican Church. Does that sometimes feel like entirely different or maybe even opposing worlds, or is it more intertwined, would you say?
Well, they're very different worlds, but I can see connections between them. And I think one of the things I find really interesting is this general question of how you can work with different disciplines, different insights, which at least on the face of it seem to be taking you in different directions, but actually might offer you the possibility of enrichment. So for me, that they certainly are different, but different does not mean incompatible. It may mean they give us insights which we need to bring together to give us a richer vision of our world and ourselves.
All right. And like I said, it's you get the opportunity to give an opening statement of about 10 minutes. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David. So first question, do people care about God? Well, I think the answer is some do and some don't. I have to say that when I was a teenager back in the 1960s, I did not care at all for God. In fact, I regard God as being simply irrelevant and possibly rather malevolent. I saw atheism actually being very trendy. And I believed it was the only serious option for a natural scientist like myself. Because after all, everyone back in the 1960s thought that science and religion were at war with each other. But of course, we have moved on from there. I think that since the 1990s, serious scholarship has shown that the idea of some total war between science and religion actually is a bit of a rationalist myth dating from the 19th century. And the relationship actually is much more interesting and much more complex. And that's why it's such fun to study and to teach. But going back to the 1960s, I think I saw God then as a consoling belief that was invented by inadequate people. What Sigmund Freud calls a wish fulfillment. But of course, it's not really that simple, is it? Because many do not wish there to be a God at all. Many reject God because they do not want there to be a God. And of course, one of the philosophers I enjoy engaging with is Thomas Nagel. And he was quite clear that he did not want God to exist. He didn't like the idea at all. And so, if you like, he developed rational arguments against the existence of God to support his desire that there should be no God. And that's a very interesting point, because the psychologist Jonathan Haidt and others have pointed out that very often people begin by working out what they would like things to be like, and then construct rational arguments in defense of that position. It doesn't matter whether you want there to be a God or you don't want there to be a God. Very much the same process sometimes is going on. But I have to say that when I was a teenage atheist, I found myself experiencing some awkward doubts about my commitment. Why exactly had I embraced atheism? Well, certainly it was trendy back in the 1960s, but it also resonated with my desire for autonomy, because I wanted to do what I liked without having to worry about acting in accord with something that was greater or better than me. Which wasn't of my own choosing or creating. But you see, when I began to think about that a bit more critically, I began to realize this seemed to be awfully similar to Freud's idea of a wish fulfillment, because in many ways I was inventing a worldview to fit in with what I wanted. And of course, Freud argues we invent an imaginary God to console ourselves, and I began to wonder if I'd invented atheism so I could be free of any accountability to some transcendent reality. And in the end, I embraced Christianity at university because I came to see it gave me a deeply rational, but also existentially satisfying account of the world, which helped me, for example, to make sense of the success of science, but also actually helped me to understand what its limits were. But then we come to the second question, which is the one I really want to talk about. Should people care about God? And I actually think they should. Whether you think it's right or wrong, I still think you should care about this. And I want to open up, if I may, 3 lines of reflection and discussion with you. First of all, I used to be a natural scientist, and my undergraduate work at Oxford was in chemistry, focusing on quantum theory, and then my doctorate was in biological systems. But as a scientist, I was acutely aware of the problem of the limits of the scientific method. And many of you will know this very famous quote from Albert Einstein, who I studied in depth during my first years at Oxford. Einstein remarked, and I quote, "The scientific method can teach us nothing beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other." And of course, that raises this question, what about things that lie beyond the scope of the scientific method, like value or meaning, and of course, God? And for me, thinking about the question of God is a classic example of working out how we can move beyond a purely scientific worldview and discover a richer vision of reality. Now, of course, we need to talk about this, because some might say, well, look, we can't go beyond science. I'm sure that'll be something we can come back to later in this discussion. But for me, science is precise and reliable within its fields of competence, but that it isn't really able to engage with what the philosopher Karl Popper called ultimate questions, which are so important, I think, to meaningful and authentic human existence. And of course, many of these concern how we live as a community, how we live as individuals. And these very often go way beyond the scientific method. And of course, some of these also offer us a grand vision of life, which inspires us to be active in society and our culture. So this is all about really how we fit into a bigger scheme of things. And for many who believe in God, and certainly I include myself, this is the foundation, but also the empowerment of our moral and social activism. So that's one point I think is worth thinking about. But there's a second point. And let me give you a quote from Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein, I think, is a great philosopher. And he argued that meaning and happiness arise when we believe that we are thinking and we are living in accordance with something that is deeper and greater than ourselves. In other words, not something we've invented, but something we are responding to. If you like, for Wittgenstein, we need to grasp the big picture of the universe and then figure out how we fit within this. And that really means we do need to think about these big questions about God. Back in the 1960s, I was saying I used to be an atheist. I took the view that science proved there was no God, and that was that. But actually, I now have moved away from that. I kind of lapsed atheist. But this brings me to my third point. I have some friends who refuse to think about the God question at all. Why? Well, they tell me it just leads to disagreements, to social tensions. And anyway, nobody can be really sure of the answer that you give. And you know, there's an important point there, because many of us are anxious about social fragmentation and worried about beliefs that seem to divide our culture. My view is we've got to learn to live with pluralism, and that means very often jostling, getting along with people who we do not agree with. And one of the points I'm going to stress here, because I think it's very important, is that none of the beliefs that give our lives meaning and value can actually be proved to be true. So in my view, we have a plurality of ways of thinking about ethics and politics and things, and we are unable to prove what is right. And that's certainly, I'm sort of based in Oxford, so it's natural for me to quote Oxford writers. And so I think of Isaiah Berlin, a great philosopher, intellectual historian, who simply said, look, it is obvious that you can prove shallow truths, like 2 and 2 make 4. But the really important beliefs about what is good, what is the meaning of life, whether there's a God, actually lie beyond proof. And the question is, how do we learn to live with each other if we can't actually find agreement on these? Because many of these simply cannot be resolved. Because most of us, and certainly I speak for myself, hold moral and political and existential beliefs that really matter to us, but we cannot actually prove that they are true. So I guess we have to think about this. Do we walk away from these and just say we will limit ourselves to that very small world of what we can actually prove to be true? I don't think we can. It's not a world that you can inhabit meaningfully. Well, you know, 2 and 2 make 4, that's true, but actually it doesn't make much difference. It's not existentially relevant. Because as human beings, we want to know about our meaning, our value, and our purpose, what we're meant to be doing, what society is meant to be like. And whether you believe in God or not, actually, God is very good about helping us think these things through. Now, of course, this can go wrong. Like any other belief system, God can lead to extremism and intolerance, but, and it's a very important but, it doesn't need to. But I think we really do need to learn. We can't hope to prove our moral, political, religious, or social beliefs. What I would want to say, I think, is intellectual integrity demands that we give careful thought to our beliefs. But intellectual realism demands that we recognize the limits of reason and science to answer life's big questions, which means we live with a degree of uncertainty. Now, as I said, I used to be an atheist, and I speak to you tonight as a lapsed atheist who actually came to the conclusion there was insufficient evidence for this belief. Although I must make clear, I'm very respectful of this position. It's a very important dialogue partner for me. But I remember when I was an atheist myself being deeply disturbed when I read the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell's Introduction to Western Philosophy. And some of you will know this very famous statement from its preface. He identified the main goal of philosophy as being, I quote, to teach us how to live without certainty, yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. And what he was making is that, for example, the God question can't be settled by reason or by science, and therefore we can't answer that question definitively. And indeed, Bertrand Russell himself saw atheism as a choice, going beyond the rational evidence, but something he wanted to embrace, even though he couldn't prove it. So here's the point I think is very important to our discussion this evening. Russell believed he could commit himself to a way of seeing and living within the world, even though he knew he couldn't prove it was right. See the point I'm trying to make? You can commit yourself without being absolutely certain. You see, we're all in the same position, whether you are religious or anti-religious. If you've read the psychologist William James, you'll know all about this point, because for William James, we find ourselves having to make moral decisions, but knowing that those decisions lie beyond proof. Now, Richard Dawkins, who I've engaged with on several occasions, expects his religious opponents to prove their beliefs. Yet actually he fails to apply the same criteria of judgment to his own beliefs. There's an evidential asymmetry there, which is actually, I have to say, been very severely commented on recently. Now, there's much more I could say, but I think we're going to talk about all these things later this evening. So I hope that these very brief lines of exploration will help us to open up and engage what I think is a really fascinating and important topic. And I look forward very much to having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Alistair. Very interesting. We're going to hear a lot more from you this evening. Boris,
yeah,
your story is in some ways exactly the opposite of Alistair. He's a Christian now, used to be an atheist when he was young. You're known as an atheist, am I right? Or would you say agnostic, maybe?
I'm a humanist.
A humanist.
An agnostic humanist, but to be clear, I'm atheist.
All right.
I'm atheist agnostic, but I am a humanist. Yeah.
But what many people might not know is that when you were young, there was actually a brief time, a couple of years, that you were a Christian, right?
Well, I don't know if I would call it a Christian, but when I was 9 years old, I was on a school camp, something like that, and there was every night there was somebody who said something, and it was from the Bible. I was not raised very religious, and I was not raised religious, actually. And I was struck by the things that were said, because in the Bible were parts that completely reflected what I experienced that day.
All right.
And I thought, wow, there has to be a God. Later on, 3 years later, when I was 12 or something, I recognized that it was not a spiritual, religious experience, but experienced caused by literature. Because all other kinds of books that you can read, from people far away, from other times, you can recognize yourself in that. And that's the sparkling of literature, of recognition in movies or whatever, that you even can be inspired or recognize yourself in a person, sometimes even an animal, that has the same feeling as you have. So when I was 12, I had the experience, that this was not something religious or the existence of God, it is the existence of literature.
What's for you an important reason to say, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God?
I don't think it's not very likable. Likely. I'm worse in English than Alistair, of course. But it's not very likely that there is a God. So that's why I'm an agnostic. It's a very humble way to say, of course, I cannot prove it. I cannot prove he exists. I cannot prove he doesn't exist. So it's a humble position. But I am more on the atheist side, that I think it's not there, and I don't believe in certainly that there is a personal God that really follows you in everything. I cannot imagine that will happen. Maybe there is something we cannot see and will be discovered in 1,000 years. I don't know. I'm open to that, but I don't think that he is, or she, or whatever it is, involved in whether gay marriage should be there or not. I don't think that that's something that it is dealing with. No.
All right.
And a humanist, that's why I prefer myself to call me a humanist, because I'm not very interested in what I'm not. I'm interested what I'm instead. And the values that I embrace, that is making me in a positive way what I am. And an atheist is to saying what you're not.
And you rather say I'm a humanist because that's a positive.
A positive one. Now I can talk about what is that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. You can talk about what is that in your opening statement, of course. Yeah. Also, like 10 minutes, like Alistair. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
I take that camera. Yes. is God relevant for our times? And do we care about God? Well, as you have heard, I'm an agnostic atheist / humanist. But yes, of course, the answer to that question is, of course, we have to care about God, because a lot of people in the world, even in the Netherlands, are believing in a God. So it's relevant to do that. So that's a yes. The next question is, who is God? What we are talking about here, the Christian God, the God of the book, where Jews, Muslims, Christians can have something in common with. But if you go to India, you have another God. If you go to other parts of the world, you have nature gods. If you go to other times in the world, in the history, you have gods that were worshipped, and where we only knew from history books, Zeus and Thor and those kind of gods. So it's very important about what kind of God we are talking about. And even in Christianity, for example, I have been on Sunday school, a kind of Sunday school of the very liberal Remonstrant Church in the Netherlands. And we had a reverend, and she said that you should take the Bible serious, but not literally. But if you go to a very Orthodox Protestant church in the Netherlands, and we have that too, they will say you have to take everything serious. The earth is made in 6 days. And in other Christian churches is taught the opposite and say, well, that's not true, of course. You have to see that as a metaphor. So even inside Christianity, you can talk about different gods. If you read the big philosopher Spinoza, he is saying God is the accumulation of all natural elements in the world, and he calls that a god. Yeah, if you would say that God is the accumulation of all natural things, maybe I'm a Spinoza kind of religious person then. Alistair mentioned Einstein, and he said, well, I believe in the God of Spinoza. So, what God are we talking about? And a few years ago, I was in London, and I was on Leicester Square, a very busy square in London. And a few weeks ago, there was a big a terrorist attack in Brussels. And on the square, a few Muslims were having leaflets and were handing them out to the persons. And I was very intrigued by that, because, well, it took balls to do that after such a terrorist attack. And I appreciate that, because they want to say, we don't have nothing to do with that terrorist attack. And so it's very strong to do such a thing. So I talked to them and I said, well, I'm an atheist, but I appreciate that you stand for your conviction here, and that you say we don't want to do anything with those Salafist persons who made this terrorist attack. And we had a conversation about his view on God. And he said, well, I see Allah or God as a person who knows it all, and you cannot disagree with God. And I say, well, but where in life on earth you meet a person above you where it's sensible to not once in a while disagree with? If you have a boss, or even you have your father or your mother, where you really have respect for, and you disagree with them, are you? Don't you think that it's good to, if you're the person that is above you, your parents or your boss, is doing a bad thing, or that you think that it's not good what a person is doing, that you say, well, although I respect you, I disagree with you, and I want to discuss that with you. And he said, no, he's 100% right. And I said, well, one of the best things we learn children when we are when we raise them, and I have 2 children for myself, we say you have to be honest, and the best thing to do is when you're doing something wrong, and you admit that and you learn from that. That's a good thing. We teach our children such a simple moral standard of taking responsibility and also listen to other ideas. And he said, and I said to him, why should the highest thing, in your view, in the universe, God, being not able to do such a thing that we teach our own children? So why can't you sometimes say, well, this in the Quran or in the Bible or whatever, in whatever religious book is a little bit outdated, how you view women or gays or animals and whatever. And we had, at the end of the day, we said, well, I think that it's to honor a God, to honor somebody who's above you, it's important to also sometimes disagree with somebody and to try to convince them to another point of view. And the interesting thing is, sometimes in the Bible and in the Quran, such things are visible. For example, Moses in Exodus, in the Bible is standing, well, you know, there was this golden calf, people were celebrating, and God was so angry about that and said, well, I'm going to kill all those people. And Moses, his servant, you can say, said, no, you cannot do that, God. And then in the Bible it's standing, and then God changed his mind. I, as a liberal, as an atheist, I find that an inspiring part of literature, because you see that the highest element in the world, as a metaphor, I see that as a metaphor, can change his mind. But when I quoted that part of the Bible and also a part of the Quran, where is a comparable thing, that guy, that Muslim said, no, that's you are reading it wrong. And I see it differently, because I think that is a good part of the Bible, that you can have a discussion about morals even with the boss. And I think to use God, although it's for me a metaphor, as how you cope with dogma and with power, that's usable. You can even do that even in a society that's completely atheist, because you can make a philosophical argument. Then to my last point that I want to bring here is the worth of religion. Because I think, due to history, religion is an interesting package deal of a lot of interesting things. There was in the past social security, there was a sense of community, there was a possibility to belong to something without doing anything for that. You know, if you want to join the tennis club or the hockey club, you have to have a talent to hockey or to tennis. But to join a church, there's no, you don't have to have special talent. The other way around, if you are on the fringes of society, you're welcome as well. There was social security already mentioned that. There's free entertainment, for example. There are all kind of things that are in a sandwich. That is all delivered towards people. But if you peel off religion in the elements it's made of, it's all replaceable by other things. And for example, social security, it's, I think, very good in countries like the Netherlands, but also in the UK, that poor people are not depending on welfare and the goodness of an individual church, and that you have to, do something, for example, go to church for that. I think that's good. I think because of also that we earn more money in our societies, there are other ways to inspire yourself. There are also other ways to have communities. For example, to be at an organization, or to go to do something in your neighborhood. So there are all kind of elements that were originally very sovereign and very important part of religion, and it's replaced by other things in society. And I agree with Alistair that there's more to life than only laws and social security and those kind of things, because some aspects of life are not tangible. For example, being jealous, how to cope with that. You want to have a friend, but you cannot find one. You want to marry somebody, but nobody is falling in love with you. You cannot solve that by a law. And then it's important that for those kind of life events or things that really can have a big impact on your life, death remorse, missing somebody who died. All those elements are very important in your life and should have a place in society. And I think that that it's very important for societies that are leaving churches and are very secular, that there should be more attention to those elements in life. And that's why I'm a humanist, and I'm involved in humanist organizations to organize that, because I think it's very important to do that. But you don't need religion for that. You don't need a God for that, in my opinion. So that's to start with some elements.
Yeah, thank you, Boris. So much to follow up on, so we're going to open the debate in a minute. Before we're going to do that, I have to say to the people at home, you can ask questions and you can also participate in online polls. That's via Slido, sly.do, is that right? That's right, I see it. And you can participate by using the event code Veritas. We're going to divide the debate into roughly two parts. The first part will be about why should or shouldn't we care about God more on a personal level, and the second part will be more about why should we as a society care or shouldn't care about God. So Alistair, to start with you, here in the West, especially in Europe, we see societies becoming more and more secular. Belief in God seems to be on the decline. Why should we, as individuals, on a personal level, why should we still care about the God? What is, according to you, the most important reason to still care about God?
Well, I think the most important reason is that at a personal level, because it gives you meaning, stability, and I think also that I feel I am accountable to someone who is beyond me. In other words, it's not an ethic of self-fulfillment, that in effect, I have this very strong sense that I'm accountable to someone beyond me, that in fact I'm trying to not simply be the sort of person I want to be, but rather to ask deeper questions about what I ought to be. And of course, that's a very interesting decision to follow through. So that I think is one very obvious area to begin with. The whole question of whether we need a transcendent grounding in order to be able to resist some of the trends I see towards absolutism, which need to be resisted. But I think there's another point we might very helpfully bring in here. And it's all to do with this whole question of the word secular, which you have used. And the word secularism means many things. And of course, Europeans have their own vision of secularism and think that it really ought to be seen throughout the world. It's not really. But if you look at a theorist like Charles Taylor, I mean, he's really saying that secularism is much more complex than you might think. Yeah. And perhaps it's not so much about religion being displaced. I think it is being displaced from positions of social authority. And, you know, that might be a good thing. I think I want to put that point in. But nevertheless, Taylor's making the point that actually religion changes. It always changes. It's not something you can define and crystallize and say that is what it is. The essentialist approaches to that really don't work. We're dealing with something that is that changes, that grows, that develops. And what we've got to try and do is ask whether, in fact, religion is going through a period of change into something else. In other words, is it beginning to move away from the forms of religion that dominated in Western Europe in the 19th century, for example, just something else? And that, again, seems to me to be a really important thing to do, because it's all about recognizing that there is something here. Now, of course, I will say immediately that you can make the case that this could be provided by something or someone else. Yes. But the point is that it is provided by religion, and that is one of its very significant roles. Okay. The other thing, which I will say very, very briefly.
Yeah, but maybe we can speak first on this one, so Boris can respond. You also
I'll make one more point, and then Boris will come in. And
okay, go ahead.
Well, my final point is this: there's something about human beings that means we respond to something that is bigger than us, that we want to reach out towards someone. That's one of the reasons actually why hero worship is so widespread. Actually, we feel we want to have something beyond us that we can respect. And I think that is actually something which is quite significant about certainly the case of Christianity, which is obviously the religion I know best, that in effect you feel there is something beyond you that actually doesn't just motivate you, but you're able to turn to an adoration and worship. In other words, you are in effect reaching beyond your limits. And that, of course, is about inspiration to do things, to become a better person. This whole question of motivation is really important. What motivates us to want to self-transcend, to want to be better people? Now, again, I'll hear the argument that you can provide these from other sources, but the point is, religion just does this intrinsically and naturally. So that's the beginnings of a response.
All right. So Boris, would you like to respond? Alistair is saying that religion and the belief in God helps you to look at something beyond what humans do.
Yeah, I totally respect people who are religious and are believing in God. But I think the biggest problem is that if you... No, I think I can agree in a great order to say that religion is, I call it a kind of package deal or sandwich where all kind of elements are brought together, art and everything. And that's historically interesting. Also for a humanist atheist, it's interesting, you know? So, but if the believing in God is elementary to join that, then it's a problem. I think that one of the biggest problems for religion is God, because
which is quite an essential thing usually for religion.
Yes, but the thing is, I agree that people are seeking, myself included, to something to belong to. I think that it's very important to being seen by somebody else. I think that it's very important to think beyond your own individual interest, but also think of other persons, not only of your own generation, but also future generations. I think tradition is nice because it gives you a sense of stability. But, and I can elaborate on that later on, what that should be and how open that should be, and that you also can create new traditions, because I think that's very essential for this
kind of about the traditions and other religions later.
Yeah, of course. But I think that God, to believe in God, is something that a lot of people will say, well, I can imagine that it's fun to have a society and that it's, but I don't believe in God. And if that's the porch to religion, then I'm not religious. Then I cannot join that society.
That's a clear point. Alistair, Boris is saying religion is pretty nice in some aspects.
It can be, yeah.
But the biggest problem with religion is God. What would you say?
Well, I've agreed when I was younger, but I'm not sure it's quite that simple. One of the things that really I think we need to think about here is actually what we mean by that word God, because it is so loosely and so vaguely used. And what I think I would want to say is that to be a Christian, in my case, is to recognize there's something and someone beyond me who, in effect, if you like, journeys with me through life. Now, obviously, I'm using language here loosely, but you can get the drift of where I'm going with this. That actually, this means that even when I go through very dark times, where, think of Psalm 23, that in effect, you are not on your own. I think that's a very important point. It's also very important communally, and we'll come to that, I'm sure, later in this discussion, to, in effect, know that you can be resilient. Now, again, I take the point you can find other sources of resilience, but the point is, if there is a God, then God offers that. And I do fully take the point that, of course, there might be some who would say the idea of God is a barrier. There are many other ideas that are barriers as well, or ideas that seem to be very, very simple. For example, we've had Boris talking several times about humanism. But in one sense, I'm a humanist because I want people to be what they are meant to be fulfilled. But the problem is there are multiple understandings of what human identity is all about, what human goals should be, what their telos, to use a classical Greek word, is. And that means, in effect, that we may all agree that humanity needs to be fulfilled, but there are very different visions of what that fulfillment means. So I think, we very often find at the moment we start scratching, exploring, there are many, many divergences which open things up. I think one of the things that really is important for me is simply this idea that if there is a God, then I'm not inventing. it's about discovering. It's about being accountable to something beyond myself, not something I've invented, but something I've discovered. And that to me is actually a very important point to bring out. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, when we're talking about the social aspects of things.
Yes, but you would say, Alistair, that the belief in God is essential for you to be religious. You have to have the transcendent being out there. That's an essential
the word
part.
religion is not helpful. It's kind of where it goes back to the Enlightenment. It designates a wide variety of social phenomena. Some of them believe in God, some of them do not. I think that's an extremely important point to make, that we are unhelpfully served by this term religion, which in effect implies commonality, where that commonality isn't really there. So I think we do have to be careful about this. And that's why, in many ways, I'm happier if we talk about God rather than religion, because at least we know what we're talking about. But the idea of religion is very, very difficult to define, simply because we've taken a Latin word which meant something in a very specific context and then applied it ubiquitously. And I'm afraid the result is very, very unsatisfactory. So I'm cautious about that, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Sometimes people say, there's an old Russian philosopher, I don't remember his name, he said, well, people are uncurable religious. And I don't agree with that, because I think we are uncurable looking for meaning. We are uncurable looking for stories to cope with life. And during our history as humankind, we made up all kind of stories to cope with life, to say, well, if my daughter has lived so short, or my wife or my husband has died in such a worse way, bad way, how can we make this livable? And that is the point where I think all human civilizations are trying to do something, and that's universal. So the tension to make stories is very essential to be human. And then religion is a part of that. But I also, when I introduced my religious history, I said, no, it's literature. So I can have a sense of belonging and a sense of a bigger picture when I go, for example, to the theater and see a play 500 years old, 400 years old from William Shakespeare, where somebody is talking about love, and I think, yeah, that's exactly the way how I felt 10 years ago.
But that's something other humans eventually discovered or
yeah, but it can
produced.
elevate yourself. Huh? It can elevate your existence.
Alistair
because
is saying it's important to have something that we didn't discover, something out there that is bigger than us. Isn't there? Are you really fulfilled with the literature, with the arts, with the theater? Don't you long for something beyond that, something bigger than that?
Well, I can imagine, but as a kind of a story, that you would like to have an afterlife where you meet your parents. My parents died very young. They were at the end of their 60s. So I think, yeah, they didn't meet my children, for example. So of course, I would like to believe. No, not to believe. I like that it's a fact that I can just once introduce them to my children. It would be lovely. I don't think that's the case, but I can imagine that you want that, or that you say, also metaphorical, your grandmother saying to my children, "Is that star?" That's of course bullshit. It's not true, but it's making up a story, and making up the story is not a bad idea.
But that's also saying arts and literature is not enough.
No, because to say that star is your grandmother is a kind of literature. It's metaphorical. It's not true.
And you see God in that same way.
Yeah, if we talk about
metaphor.
God, and that's the way I was talking about it. Sometimes God is a good metaphor to talk about something you cannot. It's above you, but you can try to discuss it, and that's the same with nature. We cannot fly as human beings, but we still try, and we have planes. So we played with the forces of nature.
Yeah. Alistair, Boris is saying God is enough as a metaphor, what would you say to him? Because in your opening statement, you talked about meaning too, and it sounded to me like you say the belief in God, or the existence of God even, is for you absolutely essential to have ultimate meaning. Is that correct?
Yes, I need to unpack that a bit further, if I may, but that's right. I mean, what I would want to say is that, I agree with Boris entirely that, we do tell stories. You would say to create meaning. I would very often say to transmit meaning. In other words, this is about keeping something passed down from one generation to another, because a previous generation has found something they want to be able to transmit to others. And of course, that is why biblical stories are so important in that respect. But I think there are 2 points really I think I'd like to re-emphasize here. One of them, again, is coming back to this whole idea. If I simply say, this is what I like, this is what I respond to, then in effect, I'm making myself the judge of my own world. I'm in effect inventing a world which is of my own liking and my own making. It's self-referential, and that's what concerns me. One of the reasons I find the idea of God very, very striking, apart from obvious things like being able to talk about love, meaning, and purpose, is this idea of accountability. That in effect, I am being dethroned. I am being told very firmly, you are not able to determine what is right, what's wrong. You are, in effect, have to figure it out in dialogue with somebody else. But there's another point which I'm going to make, which I think moves slightly along a different path, but it's very, very clearly relevant. When I was an atheist, I took the view that, God was in heaven, wherever that was, but I was here in time and space. And therefore, this God could simply have no relevance to me whatsoever. It is a different universe, so to speak. And that's why, of course, when you start talking about the specifics of religion, you come across the Christian idea of incarnation, which is very much that God chose to enter into human history. And therefore, in effect, we are not really talking about a metaphor. We're talking about God entering in as a person, able to enter into our history, our space, as one of us, and in effect speaking to us from where we are. And to me, that's a very powerful idea, because it really is about moving the discussion along. And it also, of course, for Christians is very, very significant, because, we are dealing in COVID with times of often great loneliness, bereavement, sadness, deep sense of disempowerment, alienation, loss. And of course, what Christians are saying is the story of Christ, which of course shows all those features, is a story to which we can attach ourselves and relate to and find meaning in it. And actually, one of the things that really excites me, that may not be the right word to use, but excites me, is that actually this story, which I believe to be rooted in the life and death of Jesus Christ, in effect, gives me a sense of being able to make sense of things and keep going, even when very often life seems to be bewildering and meaningless. And I think that Boris is right, I think, to bring out the importance of meaning. I completely agree with him here. I think the issue is, how do we find meaning in what sometimes seems to be a meaningless world? Other than try and find an exemplar, someone who is able to find meaning in it and can pass that on to us. That seems to me to be an interesting way of just moving this discussion ahead.
God, to provide that meaning, he has to exist and to be more than a metaphor. That's what you're saying. He has to be real.
I think yes to both those questions.
Yeah. Do you understand that, Boris, that for Alistair, God as a metaphor is not enough?
Oh, I respect that, and I can imagine that from his perspective he's saying that. But if I am not convinced that there is a God and not a personal God, because I think that's I cannot imagine that such a thing would exist.
Then it's a matter of belief. It's not.
Yeah, then it's a matter of belief. But I also say, for example, if you look at the suffering of Christ, that is a metaphor or a story that gives some. We have had Easter. We have a big celebration of a big, even in Corona times, we have big manifestations around the Passion of the Christ. I can imagine that people who are suffering, that they can say, well, that's a brilliant metaphor for what I am or story that where I can relate to. But there are other stories of people who have been tempted or tested too. People who have been very ill and have tried to fight that, or being a good person in those kind of situations. Even in COVID times, some literature from other pandemic times in history are, for example, told by actors in theater, and you can say, well, that's a few hundred years ago in Italy, and we are experiencing the same thing here.
Yeah.
That can also elevate a situation where we are in now. So I think, of course, Christ and certain stories in the Bible can be very interesting, inspiring for people. But there are so many books that are all doing the same thing.
I think we can see that clearly now. You mentioned the stories, and Alistair is saying, but it matters that it's real. And Alistair also said that to have to believe in God is to dethrone what humans make a little bit, to not make it the ultimate source, not make ourselves the ultimate source of everything.
In times of climate change, you should dethrone the human. I agree, as a humanist, that I think we are part of nature, we're part of the world. There are also other creatures we have to deal with, and we have also next generations that are not here. We have to take care about them too. So I think that it's very important to be a bit humble as human being, and human being can do very nasty things too. Big wars, Holocaust, the whole history is there are a lot of examples that human being can be very bad, but there's also a path of human beings that is universal. People seek, in principle, happiness, meaning, but also belonging to something. So if you are born as an Aboriginal or as a person in Sweden, or so, everybody in principle are seeking the same things. The things on the surface of culture, of traditions, if you brush that off, then people are kind of the same and seeking for the same for the essence of life. And I think that is something that is bigger than us, because then it makes yourself responsible also for the well-being for people in countries that are not doing well and not have the wealth that we have in the West. So I think that there are so many things like climate change, poverty in the world. There are so many things that are bigger than your individual thing to fight for, that I think whether you're inspired by religious ideas or non-religious ideas, you can fight for those things together.
Alistair, Boris is saying there are also many other things that are bigger than us, apart from God. What is it?
Yes, well, I think that's good. Let me respond. First of all, I want to agree with Boris completely that there are many other people who I find inspiring and deeply moving and motivating. I think, it's so good there are so many people like that. For a Christian, though, there's a slight difference here. It's not just saying Jesus did various things, he suffered in various things. It is that this shows us what God is like. In other words, that we're able to move away from a rather abstract, impersonal idea of God towards something rather more splendid. And I think that it's that idea. There's this linkage between what happened there in his life and the way God actually is. So if you like, it's about solidifying this link with God. But moving on to Boris's next point, again, it's very, very good. There are some things which are ultimate concern, and I agree with his choice. We're here in Britain at the moment, we are deeply saddened by the death of Prince Philip, who, as you will know, was one of the earliest advocates of care for nature. He was very, very clear. We need to actually take charge of things and do something about the way our world is being treated. I think he was a wonderful inspiration in that respect. And Boris is right. Very often it's the big things that pull us together. If you're a Christian, you'll add one extra thing in. You'll say that actually there is a religious motivation for wanting to do something, because if you think of nature as God's creation, then in effect it's not ours. It doesn't belong to us. It's been entrusted to us. We're screwing it up. We're messing it up in a big way. And it's a bit like somebody, if I can give you an analogy, someone entrusting to me a precious possession owned by their grandmother, and I just, treated terribly. I mean, that is an abrogation of trust. It's about not respecting somebody really important. I think that's a very helpful way of beginning to add to the many other motivations that we would want to give for climate change. It's not just that it's all about instrumental rationality. It's about, in effect, this is not our planet to mess around with. We are accountable for it. We need to do something about it. I think Boris and I are very much both concerned about this whole issue of climate change, and rightly so. I just bring this extra element into the discussion, which I think is helpful.
So you're saying the elements that Boris pointed to, the literature, the arts, the stories we tell, the bigger challenges we have as humanity that are bigger than us, you say, as a Christian, I have all of those things too? Plus,
no,
I can add something extra, namely
I would say
God.
that with something this important, you want as many people coming together as possible, and therefore you will de-emphasize division, you will emphasize commonality, you'll stress the importance of the task, and you'll also ask, what does each group bring that is distinctive and important to the conversation? I'm just saying, one of the Christians would bring is, this isn't our world in the first place. We kind of have messed up here. We've got to do something about it. And I'm not in any way denying the importance of other things, but I'm saying this matters to Christians, and I think actually is quite helpful.
Boris, do you see the value in that we can say, that you can say as a Christian, this is ultimately not our world?
No, but I can say as an atheist to say this is not our world as well.
Whose world is it?
Huh?
Whose world is it?
Well, it's
According to an
everyone's world, so it's also of.
But it still belongs to humans.
No, it's not belonging to humans. It's also belonging to humans, but it's not only of us, but also of the plants and animals. But it's also of future generations. I find it very inspiring to do some things for future generation that I don't know.
But
you're
I
a
can
father
imagine
yourself.
Alistair saying, I can do that too for future generations.
Yeah, of course, but I don't. I'm not an atheist No, what's the word for it? Evangelist. That I want to say, well, you have to be an atheist. No, I am that, or a humanist. And if somebody else is inspired by something else, that's all right.
That's fine.
That's fine. But the thing is that I can be inspired even by things that I will never see. I think I find it very inspiring to see that we now have some kind of little car on Mars, and they think, well, maybe in 200 years I will not see that. We will have a city on Mars. I can be very inspired by that. I hope.
And you don't. I immediately think, well, that's great for the people that live in 200 years, but I want to be part of that too.
Yes, but I think that people in that age will say maybe how good it is to that generation before that were also already investing in such a thing. I find it very interesting that sometimes people have written in the past things about our times. And to read that and to say, well, is something true of that? Did they get it right or wrong? That's interesting. So I think to think about future and past generations is giving me, like literature, also a kind of spiritual experience.
Yeah.
But a very humanist one.
Yeah.
To say, well, it's beyond me. It's beyond me.
But just to make it clear, are you saying that God might possibly add something to that, like Alistair is saying, but I just can't believe God exists? Or
No,
are you saying, I don't really need God?
I think both.
Both.
And the thing that I also, what I don't like about parts of religion and also parts of Christianity is the wizardness of some things. Have read the whole Bible, and certain aspects I find very interesting from a literal part of view, and sometimes I really find it inspiring. For example, the person of Christ, even though part may be made up because it's written very long after he lived, So even that some things are more literature than factual, I don't care. It can be an inspiring story, like a fiction book or a fiction film can also be inspiring. So that's how I read it.
But it's
But
more
where I think that it's that I don't follow it anymore is when Christ is walking on water or he stand up out from death.
the miracles.
The miracles, I think, why this wizard kind of things? Because the basic human things a person in the Bible is saying, that's enough. And that you can, I don't need those kind of wizard and also a God like a wizard in the sky. It's not convincing for me. It's
So
not even inspiring
You're
for me.
saying the problem with religion is God, and the problem with Jesus is miracles, basically.
Is the wizard stuff. Yeah.
How would you respond, Alistair?
Let me just pick up a point. I'm going to answer this, don't worry about that. I was very interested by Boris's reference to going to Mars. I thought it was really interesting. I mean, like Boris, I thought, isn't this technologically wonderful? But part of me thought, if we mess up Mars as we have messed up the Earth, we ought not to be going there. Because we find there's something about history. This is Husserl, you all know this. It's about, there's an human instinct to dominate. And what you begin by doing is exploring and understanding. And then once you've explored and understand, you try to dominate. And I just worry that's what's going to happen in the case of Mars as well. But anyway, back to wizardness. I know what you mean. I mean, basically, what I'd want to say is clearly there is something going on here, which is very, very strange. And I think that we do have this difficulty, which is that we have this idea about the uniformity of nature, the fact that things always happen the same way in the same time. And I'm cautious about this because as I read the Gospels, I see various things happening, which do strike me as being quite dramatic, quite strange sometimes. And yet they are clearly part of a picture. And I would want to say that one of the things that really interests me here is trying to work out what actually drew people to Christ in the first place. And some may have been these miracles, which may be explicable on rational grounds, I don't know. But clearly they persuaded people there was someone here who was really very special and very different. So what I would want to do is to say that there is something here which I think does make Christ stand out. And one of the concerns I have is I think that very often we have our own understanding of what is reasonable, of what is not reasonable, and sometimes we retroject that back onto earlier generations. If I give an example, I mean, for example, 100 years ago, we all thought in a very rational way that the universe has always been here. Nowadays, we think the universe came into existence, but actually we are totally unable to explain why this happened. You know, the rationale for it completely eludes us. So I think there is an important point there. But can I say, I would like to talk about, our understanding of human nature, because I think that is actually a very important thing. We're talking about God, and I like that very much, but there's also this issue about, the nature of human beings and whether we want to talk about, as I would want to do, human fallibility, human weakness, sometimes something that actually makes us do wrong things. If so, what that says about the nature of humanity and what actually we need if we're going to address the challenges we face, for example, dealing with climate change and other things like that. Because it seems to me the whole, if you like, the idea of God, the flip side of that is who are we? And I think that'd be a very interesting topic to move on to if we had the time sometime this evening.
Yeah. What would you say does the weakness of humanity has to do with God?
Because we like to think we know what is right, and we like to think we're able to do it. And the difficulty is very often we simply are unable to do what we know to be right because we are entangled. We are caught up in networks of relationships, in our own preoccupations, our own concerns. And actually, the real difficulty is that we may say that is right, and then do something very, very different. I mean, it's not necessarily a religious point, although of course you can easily begin to explore this religiously, but it's about what we are like as human beings. And I think that the difficulty is that I sometimes wonder if we are actually up to dealing with the challenges that we have caused for ourselves by, for example, our behavior towards the natural environment. Because I think that to me is a real concern. You know, that I think we all recognize the problem there. The issue is how on earth we're able to break free from selfish concerns and do something about this.
All right. Boris, you can respond, and then we go on to the next to the next segment.
Well, I think it's very important to look at human nature, and that the human nature also have boundaries, and that we have limitations as human beings. And I find it very inspiring to, for example, read a lot of the research on primates, these apes that are very close to us in DNA, because sometimes some elements of our behavior and our problems are remarkable, recognizable in primates. For example, one of the things that I find very, not inspiring, because it's also a little bit sad, is that there is a maximum in our human nature towards empathy. For example, with primates it's like 25 or 50 or something, and human beings have an average of 150. That we have sympathy, and of course one has more than the other, but the very fact that there is a limitation to our empathy, because we can, scientifically see that and check that, as human beings we can do something about that. We can make social security systems, we can go beyond our human nature, but we have to accept also in our daily life that that we have limits, and that we have to work with them, and that we have to try to overbridge them. And I think sometimes to look at science and to see our limitations is very important. And I think to address them in societies can also be done by just looking at science and, for example, primate scientific research.
Interesting. I'm sure Alistair would like to respond. Maybe you could do that a little bit in the next segment, because we're flowing into the next segment by talking about this topic, I think. Because we talked about why should we care about God on a personal level, but of course it's also important to talk about why we should or shouldn't care about God as a society. What does a society lose or maybe gain if the belief in God fades more? Boris, to start with you on this one, would you generally say for a society the decline in the belief in God is progress, or is it a loss?
God is something different than religion. I have no opinion of people who whether they believe in God or not. So I don't say, well, it's progress, because there are a lot of people who are not involved in organized religion and they still believe in God. You have a lot of research on, for example, in the Netherlands, but also the UK.
You're not one of those atheists that sees the latest polls and sees, religious believers are less than 50%. It happened for the first time in Holland a couple of years ago. You're not standing on a table cheering.
No. I would say there's a big, there's a lot of work to do for an organization like the Humanists to also address the human nature things and the limits to address them in another way. But I think there's a difference between religion and believing in God, because people left religion far more than they left God. There are even people who say, I am believing in God, a lot of them don't go to church. They don't like church, they don't like the Catholic Church. So there's a big difference in that.
And not necessarily everyone that leaves the church is becoming an atheist.
Absolutely. So I think it's good not that society is not clinging itself to one idea of a God and to dogma. I think if that's the outcome, I think it's a good way that people make their own mind and that they have their own idea of what they believe and not believe in. I think that's good.
And Alistair, the same question to you. Would you say as a society, when the belief in God declines, we lose something?
Well, we do lose something. Let me try and explain some of the things I think we do lose, because I think for me, as I was saying earlier, one of the key things I myself wrestle with is I'm not really a very nice person. I'm really quite selfish. But if I have a transcendent vision of what God is like, then that motivates me to kind of way try and overcome my selfishness and do things which I otherwise would not do. So if you like, we're talking about God as motivation. You know, it's a great theme throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament that, in effect, you know, a vision of who God is kind of empowers you, makes you want to do good things. And I think that is something that I think if I ceased to believe in God, I think I would not do that, because again, looking back at my earlier atheism, I think actually really I was just saying, well, I want the world to be like this, and therefore I make it like that. And I think it's actually quite self-referential and possibly also a little bit selfish. So that would be one thing to say. The other thing is, I pick up on what Boris said, and he said some really interesting things, which I wish we had much more time to talk about. But he did say, look, you know, we need to be able to, you know, think things through for ourselves, arrive at our own dogmas. I think that's right. But the difficulty is that very often, in order to preserve the vision of a community, you have to articulate that in terms of beliefs, doctrine, something like that. It doesn't really matter whether you're a political organization or religious organization. It's about trying to preserve what it is that gives you your identity, so that in effect you can keep going as a community and in effect be known what you stand for. So I do recognize that dogma can be a negative thing. It can come across sometimes as being very, very aggressive or arrogant, but nevertheless, I think that it is trying to safeguard something of a vision which people want to try and pass on to others. And I think that that's something we need to bring into the conversation here. Yes. Do we do other things by ceasing to believe in God? I think we possibly do. And again, I have to come back to this point because it is so important. People very often will say, I think this, and then they do something very, very different. And I think that this whole idea of accountability, you know, there's someone beyond me who knows me exactly as I am. No secrets, they know me as I actually am. Well, you know, that's quite sobering. And actually it does mean that you tend to be a bit more careful about things than you might otherwise be. I think that is a very important element to try and get into this, because one of the things I'm really concerned about in our culture, we see it happening in Britain, we certainly see it happening in the United States, and I do hope it's not happening here in the Netherlands, and that is, in effect, the rise of a culture which basically is post-truth. In other words, it doesn't really matter. My truth is what matters. In other words, this language about my truth is simply saying, I decide what's right. You can't argue with me. And I think we really need to recover a public vision of truth. And actually, I'd want to say that the whole idea of God is linked up with that. But actually, it does go wider than the question of God. I think it is so important that we do not give up on the idea of there being some vision of truth, which doesn't just transcend any individual's idea. That at times may say to that individual, I don't think that is right. And I'm getting worried that we are losing this this commitment, which I think actually was a very important part of the European vision.
We're losing this commitment to truth, and we're emerging more and more in a post-truth society. Has to do with the fading of the belief in God.
I don't think it is. I think these are interconnected ideas. I think that there is this growing sense you do not reach for a public truth. You in effect decide for yourself what that truth is going to be. And therefore, in effect, you have a fragmentation of a vision of what truth is all about. So I'm not saying these are identical. I certainly see them as being linked.
Yes, and the first thing you said was that the belief in God makes you a better person, and that's something you see as a benefit for the whole as a society. You're basically saying that if the belief in God makes me a better person, I think it makes more people a better person, and it makes society a little bit better. Is that correct?
I'm in effect looking at a single case study, which is myself, and saying, look, I know it's happened to me, and I've been interested to know what happens to others. I don't want to extrapolate from this and make a universal rule, but nevertheless, there is this sense that you know, you do need to be inspired to do something good, and I'm sure you can find inspiration elsewhere. But certainly, if there is a God, then that is inspiring.
Boris? Religion makes, and the belief in God makes Alistair a better person. I'm sure he's not the only one.
Oh yeah, we have met only by this medium, so I fully believe that he is a better person because of his beliefs, and I'm not criticizing that.
Yeah.
But well, there's research of societies like UK, but also the Netherlands, on how people doing good for society and where they're getting their inspiration from. And it's very interesting. For example, I think the UK and the Netherlands are countries like Scandinavia, like Belgium, where people do a lot of voluntary work. That's one of the biggest, that's really what our society keeps together. And churches, of course, but also the hockey, the tennis, the sports, all kind of singing together, choirs, all those kind of things. That's the real gold of our society. And one of the things that worries me is that sometimes in certain areas, but also under certain age categories, it's declining. So that people are not involved in organized things. And whether it's a religious thing, a church, or something else, I think it's very important to belong to something, to see each other, to also in pandemic times, we have seen that sometimes a football club can be helpful in reaching out to older fans to say, well, we can do your groceries.
Yeah.
So I think to belong to something, you can go to church, but you can also be of Feyenoord, of a football club, and do such things. So to be a part of something bigger is, I think, very important, and where it declines, it's bad for society. Another thing,
and that also goes for religion.
But religion is one element where you can do that, but it's not only done there. The other thing is that, and that's, I agree with the worries of Alistair, is that there is not a common ground anymore. And I wanted to say two things about that. First, I think for a democracy, like UK and the Netherlands are, it's very important to see democracy not only as a thing that you do once for a year in our country to say, well, this is the new government, but that there's also a sense of mentality, a democratic mentality, that our society is built of people who are on a daily basis involved in compromising and discussing, in understanding how a society works, and that you sometimes have to give in a little bit to make it work. And I think that voluntary work on a very primitive level in your own village is essential for the bigger picture of a country. That's first. So I think it's very important that those wiry elements in our the small wiry elements in society is essential for a good society. The other thing is that I think, and then I come back to my literature thing, I think it's very important also for society to have common stories.
Yeah.
I think it's very important to have songs that are sung on every grammar school, so that when you're growing up and you say, oh, I know that song too. It's very primitive, but it's very essential to have, when I was small, and and maybe you're a little bit younger than I am, but we had 3 television broadcasting stations.
Yes.
So every Friday night we looked at the same show.
Yeah.
Ron's honeymoon quiz or something, and you had the same experience. Those kind of same experience moments in our society, because of internet and all those kind of things, we are so fragmented that we have no common ground. Sometimes we look at the Olympic Games, or when the king is crowned or something, but there are less and less moments that we have the same. But how does that tie into
God?
No, I don't need God. But I think if you peel off the reason that Alistair and other people say why they need God is to have a common ground. And I think you can organize a common ground in different ways. We already do. You
said in your opening statement all elements of religion, and you mentioned a couple that you find positive. You say all elements of religion are replaceable.
And they already are. And I think that we have to care about those wiry elements in our society, a democratic mentality, and common stories.
That we all agree on, I think, that it's important. But you're saying we can find that in other places And we don't have to find it in church.
We
or
are
we have
already
to
doing
find
that.
it. We are already doing that, but
Yeah.
you're also seeing the worries side of that.
Well, the same thing that a church is worrying that they becoming empty, some voluntary organizations are seeing also that they are empty and they're nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to say as a moral standing point, whether you're religious or not religious, like I am, it's important for society that there are small society, little wiry organizations to have common ground.
Alistair, Boris is saying all the elements are replaceable. In fact, they are already being replaced. Do you agree?
No, I think some of them are. Social functions are being changed, and that's because religion is changing. I mean, the churches very often did not have these social functions in the past. They've acquired them, maybe they move on. But you can't replace God. I mean, you can in effect place a human being there and in effect say this is what God is like, but that's not really going to work very well. We've seen, what happens when individuals pretend to be God. Look at Hitler or Stalin. I think it's really quite worrying. I think one thing I very much enjoyed hearing Boris talking about was this quest for something commonality. And of course, I was thinking here of the sociologist Christian Smith, who has this wonderful analysis of narratives in sustaining social identity. And he makes the point that most people weave together several quite different narratives, very often a political narrative or an economic narrative or a personal narrative and a religious narrative. And of course, these are quite different, but they're able to weave them together in different ways. I think one of the points I want to make, therefore, is that actually, having a religious narrative, which you think is very important, does not in any way preclude you from becoming engaged in normal human interaction. I think that's a very important point. But there is something I would like to mention, and it's this. Why do communities form? Well, very often it's because they gather around some common object of adoration or something really important. I feel like a society forms because there is something at their heart which matters to other people. And again, what I'm wondering is that as I look at statistics of involvement in political parties, attendance at church, voluntary organized, all these things which in the past would have been markers of social engagement, they are all going down, all of them. And what I'm wondering is whether, in effect, we are seeing a sort of trend towards a radical individualism, which very often is nourished by looking at computer screens and mobile phones rather than perhaps talking to other people. And I'm just wondering whether, in effect, we are seeing something which may be irreversible. And if you like, it's a technologically enhanced social process. And I'm just wondering, first of all, whether we think this is a good thing. And secondly, if we do, if we think it's bad, what on earth can we do about it? I mean, I'm very old, so I struggle with Facebook, but I do worry about the use of the word friend to mean someone you have an electronic connection with. A friendship is a bit more than that. So what I'm worried about really is that I think that whether these things are linked together or not, there is certainly a decline in religious sociality, but alongside that, there is a decline in sociality in general. And that does make me worried. I link it with the post-truth thing. I don't need to relate to other people. I know what's right. And we see the same sort of thing happening here. So that is something which I think is another cause for concern, I'm afraid.
Right. Thank you, Alistair and Boris. We are running out of time. We had so much fun. I was losing track of the time, and we always also have some questions from the audience to go to. I ask you both kindly to answer them briefly, so we can get to some of them. Anonymous is asking if Boris could choose between a cosmos with a loving personal God or an atheist universe, what would he like to be true? That's a good question, Boris.
But what would that lovable God do for me then? So I don't.
You would have eternal life. You would have the opportunity.
I don't think that it's good for beings to be eternal life. I think because we are in a kind of hurry in our lives, we have more of a sense of of life that we can appreciate it more. So I don't think it's a good thing to strive to eternal life.
All right. It ties into the question for Alistair from, I have to get that right, from, it changed a little bit. Where did the question go? It just, there it is. Also anonymous. It's also about the afterlife. Alistair, Anonymous is asking, are heaven and hell important reasons to care about God, the afterlife?
I personally think that it's God, full stop. God is what really matters. If you don't want to be with God, well, it's fine. You want to be with God because God's so wonderful. That's true. But going back to the other question, I would be an atheist. I'd rather be an atheist, frankly, because then I can do what I like. But the problem is that I just feel compelled to believe in God because I think that's the way things are. It's not me making things up. It's saying I've got to be like this. So if there is a God, then that I respond to that. And that's why the whole idea of heaven is important, because it's about actually encountering a God who you know indirectly, imperfectly in this life, but you believe encountering will be something really very wonderful.
All right. Laurens is asking, Boris, are important humanist values like equality really universal? Weren't they brought into the world through religion, specifically by Jesus' teaching?
Yeah, that's always a little bit of a very historical complex thing, because we are standing on shoulders of all of our ancestors. So have Christians been able to, or have they joined in the idea of equality in the world? Yes, and there are a lot of Christians who have done the opposite. There were a lot of Christians who introduced slavery, and there were also Christians who make it end. And there were already people who were atheist or non-religious or had a hedonist view of life in the Roman area. There were already teachings in the old Greek philosophy that are very interesting also for our time. So it's not true that equality came from Jesus. There were also elements of Christianity that were already thought by the ancient Greeks. So it's not, we cannot claim universal rights towards the Muslims, the atheists, or the humanists, or it's it's the story of humankind and the fights between them. Erasmus was a Christian, but he was opposite by other Christians. So what is Christianity?
And a humanist, of course.
And a humanist. So
yeah.
I think it's more complex to say it's coming from Christianity, because it's simply not true.
It's such an interesting question, I think, Laurens, and I'm also going to address it to Alistair. Can you briefly answer that question? Alistair, do you see humanism and the values humanism promotes essentially as Christian values?
Well, with Erasmus of Rotterdam, he was a humanist. He was a Christian. He's one of my favorite people. I think he's great. I think if I can make this very important point, I mean, we speak of equality. That's an abstract idea. The question is, how do we implement? And what we've seen is an enhanced vision of implementation, actualization over the years. I mean, they had democracy in ancient Greece. If you were male, if you were not a slave, that was great. But for the rest of people, it wasn't there. What I welcome is that the vision has been sustained and expanded. And to me, that's very important.
Yeah, I think it's also important to stress that humanism, for example, is not only a Western Christian thing. If I looked, I'm in a board with Humanist International, and some of my Indian and friends and from Nepal, they say we have traditions that are humanist-like for thousands of years before even Christ. So there are views in other parts of the world that are not very known in the West that are very secular or humanist or whatever. So we shouldn't focus only on the traditions we have from ancient Greece and the Roman Empire. There are other traditions and other inspirations in the world too.
All right. A question from Daniel for Alistair, but I think it's a question for you both. Do believers make for better citizens than non-believers? Is there a connection between belief in a good God and good behavior? We also already talked about that a little bit, but maybe that's a great final question to end this evening on. Would you say believers make for better citizens than non-believers, Alistair?
Well, it's a great question, but it's also a very difficult question to answer.
Hmm.
If you think about the early Christians in the Roman Empire, I mean, that they basically felt very ill at ease in that context. They weren't sure if they could be good citizens. They felt they didn't belong. But then, of course, things changed. My own view is that there is nothing to stop Christians being good citizens and working for the common good. I think that would be a very obvious thing to say. But if I may say so, implementing that actually is quite difficult, because clearly we have to deal with this whole question of how what happens if there are aspects of a national vision which might, for example, be seen to be difficult for Christians. For example, if Christians were not allowed to worship, that would be a very serious issue. And in fact, that has been a big issue in England during the COVID crisis, where in effect we only now worship really electronically, and that people have felt very, very uneasy about that. So I think the answer is there's no reason why they should be, but there will be details that need to be addressed to actually discuss this in practice.
All right.
Well, I think if you look at very populist answers would be look at the most happiest and safest countries in the world, and they're almost all countries that are a majority not religious. So if people say, but that's a very populist answer, because it has also to do with education and with wealth and those kind of things. But I think even I talked about voluntary work. A lot of people who are religious do a lot of voluntary work. But the interesting thing is that the most orthodox are doing it only for themselves. And the open
How do they know that? They ask
that's scientists of the SCP. That's
okay.
But the people who are more open-minded Christians or religious, they do it for whole society. And I think there is the humanist aspect, that if you are doing good only for your own group, then I think, well, that's okay, but it's friendly to do that. But if you're really good for the rest of society, then you also do something for other people who are not of your tribe. And I think it's very important to whether you're religious or not religious, we should give that extra energy to quick respond to the churches and the worshipping. I think it's very important to give all the elements where religion has a status aparte, privilege towards other life stances. I think it's bad. I think in our law system, religion should be treated like humanism, like every other. One of the reverends that I know from a very liberal church who said, I only want to open my church again for the public when an orchestra, the Concertgebouw on the Concertgebouwplein, on the Museum Square in Amsterdam, can open its doors as well. And I think that's a very good point.
You can come together as humanists in a church, and you can have that.
Yeah, but
you can do that too. So
yeah, but I think the inspiration that you get from for example, a beautiful concert or a beautiful sermon in a church, that should be treated by the government in the same way. And I think it's very important also for religion that they don't focus too much on that separate status. I think it's not good. It's not helping religion either.
But that's an entirely different.
That's an entirely different discussion.
Alistair, any closing thoughts before we?
Yes, I just in what Boris was saying. But it isn't quite that straightforward. In fact, I think this is the point at which Boris and I might have a disagreement. I would just say that I could give quite an extensive analysis of the situation, which might be rather different to his. But I would say that it would be my hope that religious believers would be good citizens, not because they're trying to get things out of it, but because they have a sense of empowerment and commitment to other people, and we want to be able to express that in whatever ways seemed appropriate.
Yeah. And I think there's some common ground to be found. You don't?
I think that we have a common ground, that there's more only than money, economics, and those kind of things. And I think whether you're religious or not religious, all those life moments should be taken as very serious in our societies, because that is giving us meaning of life and also strength for the future.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's nice to end the evening on common ground,
yes.
I'd say. And it's been 9:30 already. We enjoyed it too much. I did, at least. And it's been an honor to talk to you, and I'm gonna give it away to Timon right now.
Thank you, David. So the end is near, but not before I've mentioned 3 things. First, if this forum got you thinking and you want to have a follow-up conversation, please let us know through filling in our survey, which you can find in the link of this in the description of this YouTube live stream. You can also give us feedback through our survey, and if you want to receive Mr. van der Ham's book for free, please fill out the survey. We will allot 30 books, De Vrije Moraal, among the respondents, so you have a high chance of winning this book. I want to thank you for watching tonight. I hope you enjoyed it and that this conversation got you thinking. We will be back next academic year with brand new ideas and new events. A little spoiler, there might be free beer. But in the meantime, we will keep you updated through our social media. And for now, I'd say farewell, and we hope to see you next time.